Welcome to Why Won't a Hysterectomy Cure Hysteria? I'm your host, Gypsy Roche. Let's get going. Imagine you've just woken up and no matter how hard you try, you cannot get out of bed. I'm not talking about the days when you just don't feel like getting up or would rather stay snuggled with someone special. I mean your body is cemented to the mattress, and no matter how hard you try or how important it might be, you cannot get yourself upright. WTF, right? Now imagine a neurologist you never met before telling you the problem is caused by a mental rather than physical illness. That your subconscious mind is trying to avoid something so it won't let you stand up. What is it avoiding? The neurologist doesn't ask, and your subconscious doesn't tell. Sound like a plot twist in a thriller? It's not. It's a real possibility, and it's even more unsettling when you learn sometimes all it takes is one specialist unfamiliar with your specific symptoms to reach this conclusion. I know, because it happened to me. This diagnosis nearly shattered my life, but what I've learned from this ordeal and what I'm sharing in this video could make all the difference for you. I'll start out by admitting I haven't always been of sound mind. In high school, I puked up more Jack Daniels than my fellow band geeks ever drank. And then there was that intense yet disastrous 6-month love affair with cocaine in my early 20s. In my defense, I do have moments of brilliance. One came in 1987 when, at the ripe old age of 23, I broke up with both Jack and Coke. But my recovery got off to a rocky start. A year later, I checked myself into rehab to prevent relapse after being raped by a sexual predator I met at a sober dance. That rehab stay both saved and upended my life. It helped me stay clean through that horrible time and forced me to look at myself, who I'd become, and who I wanted to be. This fueled a radical change in the course of my life, starting with therapy and college. Fast forward to 2010, I'd been sober half my life and spent the previous 2 decades working as a systems analyst at some of the world's most prestigious companies. A year into a graduate program in software engineering, I'd weathered divorce, loss of loved ones, financial turmoil, and infertility. And then there were the gut-wrenching therapy sessions where, over time, I'd overcome the trauma of the rape as well as the violence of my upbringing, leaving nothing I'd need to drink away. Despite my many experiences, sometimes I was still a little naive. So when I wound up in the hospital, barely able to lift my arms for no apparent reason, I shared about my sobriety and rehab. What I didn't know is I inadvertently set the stage for my own personal nightmare before Christmas. Those dark days in 2010 officially began when I woke the next morning and couldn't stand up. And like Thor on Thanos, the medical professionals went straight for my head. In the months leading up to this mess, I was carrying some heavy baggage. I'd lost a pregnancy, and my God, thanks to a failed faith experiment that's covered in my Unraveled video series, those losses weighed on me like a ton of bricks, making what was about to happen even more brutal. Usually, standing up is a no-brainer, but that day, it wasn't happening. I was stuck. Here's where my years of trauma therapy kicked in. Instead of panicking, I did what I knew best, calmly assess the situation. My professional experience had taught me how to systematically tackle problems, so that's exactly what I did while lying in bed, holiday music and nurse chatter in the background. I retraced my steps from the previous day when weakness suddenly hit my arm, spread to both arms, and then to my legs. My husband had rushed me to the ER, but they couldn't figure out what was wrong, so they admitted me for observation and testing. That morning, I had a bit more control over my arms, but when I tried to stand, my body stayed put. I could move my legs, but my butt was glued to the bed. And let me tell you, trying to lift my midsection off the bed, forget it. It was like a weird, frustrating, sort of paralysis thing. I laid back, prepared to explain my symptoms to the doctor, hoping for a quick answer. I waited long enough that I must have drifted off because out of nowhere I heard a woman's voice saying, "You look depressed." Wait, what? My brain scrambled to respond. I'm not depressed, I just can't stand up. Open your eyes when you speak to me. Seriously? I shot a glare at her, able to focus quickly on the embroidered word neurologist on her white coat, then shut them again out of pure rebelliousness. I opened them again when she asked me to demonstrate what I meant by I can't stand up. She said she would order some tests, but she didn't think they'd find anything. What? The primary care wasn't any better. Both came in the next day to tell me the results came back clean, then left. I lay in bed and waited to see what they'd do next. I waited 2 days in which I was forced to ask the nurses to help me tune from the bathroom and becoming almost envious of my roommate's ability to freely use her bedside bucket commode. I repeatedly asked the nurses for word on a diagnosis or treatment, but got nothing. On the third day, out of sheer desperation, I called the hospital administrator, hoping to at least get a different care team. Their response? I couldn't fire the doctors I'd never hired. What, again? Unexpectedly, this led to a visit from the head nurse who scolded me for calling administration. But that call shook something loose. The neurologist returned that day while I was stuck waiting for a nurse to help me off the toilet. As I was trying to cover my privates with the hospital gown, she leaned on the door jamb explaining, "Oh look, you're up!" She didn't bother waiting for me to explain how I got there. She just asked what tests I was expecting them to run. Now, I work in software design, not neurology. I asked for a full set of MRIs, head and spine, the only kind of tests I knew of for paralysis, just to cover my bases. When the MRIs came back clean, I felt a strange mix of relief and frustration. I didn't want a terrible disease, but without a diagnosis, how could I get treatment and move forward? Then, I guess to prove they were doing their job, they ordered therapy. The next day, a totally new doctor appeared to discharge me. When I asked what they'd found, he smugly said, "There's nothing wrong with you." Deep breaths, Gypsy, deep breaths. Whew. Not to worry, I had a plan. I already set up an appointment with a local neurologist, a guy who had previously helped me with a pinched nerve. He'd surely crack this case, right? So, I thought I was on the path to clarity with my new neurologist, but boy was I wrong. This guy, whom I had pegged as my savior, proceeded to poke me with needles, zap me with shocks, and then declared all the results normal. But something still felt off. The neurologist casually dropped, "Stress can cause all sorts of physical issues, like ulcers." He then shared a story about a woman who had seizures but showed no signs on his equipment. According to him, it was all in her mind. I remember thinking, oh, poor woman, she must have had some serious issues. I can be really ignorant sometimes. He diagnosed me with a functional neurologic disorder and sent me off to physical therapy. Great, I thought, official sounding and curable. I'd be back to normal in no time, right? Wrong. When I checked the referral paperwork, I noticed something that made me do a double take. My hospital diagnosis was listed as conversion disorder. Just what I needed, 2 diagnoses. When I got home, I looked them both up. Whoa. Cue an unexpected deep dive into ancient history. Let's rewind to the Greeks. Ever heard of a hysterectomy? Of course, everyone has. It's the procedure where they remove the uterus. But hysteria? Most of us think that's what happens when you binge watch funny cat videos. But hold up, both terms share the prefix hyster, so they must be related, right? And not quite. And here's where it gets wild. Now guys, hang in there because I know you're probably thinking that, oh goodness, this sounds like girl stuff. What does it have to do with me? I'm gonna stop watching. But this has everything to do with you too. So stay with me. Thousands of years ago, Greek thinkers had a bafflingly simplistic view of female behavior. Sometimes women didn't swoon over them or got cranky, and those ancient dudes were stumped. But they were the ancient Greeks, and they invented everything, so they put their heads together, and what did they do? Well, with no antiperspirant, minty fresh toothpaste, or x-rays in sight, they came up with the most brilliant explanation ever. Women, unlike men, had wombs. Yep, wombs. So they crafted a mythology where the womb could shrivel up and wander around the female body, wreaking havoc on other organs, causing mood swings, discomfort, foul humors, and all sorts of things that men didn't care for. And the cause of this wandering womb? Drumroll please. Insufficient sex. Yep, you gotta hand it to them. They came up with a way to scare the ladies into putting out. I can just picture the town criers spreading the news and those helpful Greek dudes hiking up their togas to treat the afflicted. And to avoid dissent from women who knew better, they coined a 4-syllable term, hysteria, to lend it an air of authority. And if women disagreed, well, they clearly had the disorder and their arguments could be safely ignored. So how many women do you think were cured of hysteria by having their uterus removed? Did it magically turn them into agreeable nymphomaniacs? I'm guessing the answer is none and definitely not applicable. Hysteria actually remained a thing in medicine until the 1900s. That was when Sigmund Freud, that famous junkie neurologist, he took it to a whole new level. I mean, he took a whacked out idea and, using his own special brand of science, made it go positively viral. We're talking Tide Pods viral, only more harmful. What, you ask, did he do? I'll make this TikTok brief. Freud studied neurologic patients with symptoms that didn't make sense to him and concluded the subconscious of those patients was out to avoid something by developing imaginary ailments and disorders. It was the early 1900s, after all. They had perfect knowledge of every disease and access to the best in diagnostic technology. Everything important was already known, at least to him. After all, he was Sigmund Freud. If something was wrong with those patients, he would have known, right? I know you must be wondering, now, wait, why am I talking about the subconscious? Didn't I just say Freud was a neurologist? Was he a psychiatrist too? Well, no. Okay, so now you want to know what exactly the patients were avoiding? It doesn't matter, at least not to Freud or anybody who believed his theories. They were so sure of his brilliance, he didn't even need psychiatrists to confirm when he applied his diagnoses, nor did he require it for any of his neurologic brethren. In fact, medicine dispensed with the need for psychiatry full stop in these cases. They didn't even require mental health professionals to take part in treatment. Not then, and not now. Yeah. But don't worry, Freud did the male gender a total solid and he let them develop his new version of hysteria too. But he renamed it to keep them from getting embarrassed. I mean, dudes don't have wombs. Could you imagine some poor guy breaking the news to his wife that he had hysteria? Surely every wife who'd ever had her judgment questioned by a doctor would have had a chuckle. No, that would be cruel. Instead, he called his disease, did you already guess? Conversion disorder. Okay, so they took a Greek myth and they made a modern disease out of it. Yep. Are you confused? You're not alone. Doctors had a lot of trouble figuring it out too, probably because Freud's definition of this mental to physical disease flip-flopping affliction couldn't be proven, and it was written in a way that made very little sense. Oh, and it still contained references to hysteria, a word that screamed chick disease. So for women with unexplained symptoms, the 1900s started and ended in pretty much the same place, ancient Greece. You gotta hand him to him, though. He knew how to make the most of a bad idea. Speaking of which, let's get back to those viral Tide Pods. Did you know that in varying degrees, people with certain life-threatening autoimmune diseases can, thanks to Freud, get diagnosed with conversion disorder if their neurologist doesn't know what the real issue is? Yeah, we're talking 5 to 15% of people who seek neurologic care are given a mental illness label. That enduring notion of hysteria, by delaying or preventing accurate physical diagnosis, contributes to one of the leading causes of death among young to middle-aged women. Fast forward another century, and the net effect of Freud's input to neurology, was that all who followed in his neurologic footsteps were, with the introduction of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, I'll just say DSM because it's hard to say the other, They were given license to wipe their hands of any and all patients they couldn't diagnose. All they had to do was point to a single stressor that occurred in the patient's life. Ever. Let me put it in perspective. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 3 men are sexually molested by the age of 16. Roughly half of all marriages end in divorce. Tons of Americans carry debt, and everybody loses somebody they love. All of these are stressors that could have been considered a trigger for conversion disorder. Each one of those people could have had their physical issues dismissed for having symptoms that seem neurologic but didn't fit into a known disease pattern. That sounds nuts, right? I mean, just absolute nuts. By now, you're probably wondering why I'm going on and on about conversion disorder when I could just make the diagnosis of functional neurologic disorder. That just sounds better, more neurologic, right? Yeah, right. It does sound better. But that was the point when the American Psychiatric Association, no joke, renamed conversion disorder. Yep. Functional neurologic disorder is the new improved name for conversion disorder, which you'll remember was Freud's new name for hysteria. For reals, they changed the name to functional neurologic disorder to be more politically correct. And because patients didn't want to do what they advise them to do, because who wants to listen to a neurologist who goes straight for your head? Yeah. But hey, the American Psychiatric Association controls the names and definitions of mental illnesses now, so it's all been shrinked up, right? Neurologists can't just blame the patient's mental state when medicine can't explain their physical symptoms anymore, right? Wrong, and wrong. Plus, hold the phone. It's been made much easier. There is no longer a requirement to prove the existence of an emotional trigger. Let that sink in. They don't have to explain why this happened. They can just say it did. And this diagnosis, like conversion disorder, can be applied to children. And no, there's still no requirement that psychiatrists have to be involved to make the diagnosis or participate in the treatment. In TV programs and movies, a serious diagnosis is nearly always delivered in one of 2 ways. Bedside after the patient comes out of a coma or anesthesia, or in the doctor's office. In the second scenario, doctor and patient sit across a large desk. There's ominous music and hand-holding with the spouse, if there is one. Then the doctor prepares the patient for a shock before dramatically revealing the disease and prognosis. Once the wailing and gnashing of teeth subside, a very risky treatment or procedure is often thrown out, which, if it works, could either restore the patient to health or kill them. While waiting for my date to visit the world-famous medical clinic, a friend drove me to see Dr. A's associate, Dr. B. He was the one I'd settled for when I couldn't get in to see Dr. A. So imagine my surprise when Dr. B sent me for testing and Dr. A walked into the exam room. He poked and shocked me, then led me to a consultation room before disappearing as unexpectedly as he'd appeared. Dr. B came in minutes later, but when he started explaining functional neurologic disorder, I started gathering my things to go. Just then, Dr. A stuck his head in the door. He spoke directly to Dr. B, saying my tests had been borderline and had put me on a starter dose of some medication. Then Dr. A turned to me and said, "You might have Myasthenia Gravis. If the medication works, then we'll know for sure." So Dr. B wrote me a script and sent me on my way. I had no idea what happened, and Dr. Google didn't help much either. But I did learn that dogs can get Myasthenia Gravis, and somehow that made me seem like even if it was a very poorly described disease, it must be real. Dogs don't fake things like that. Now, left with some very contradictory diagnoses and lacking a better idea, I decided to let the world-famous medical clinic be the tiebreaker. For sure, they'd be the ones to sort it out once and for all. They knew everything. I'd hold off starting the medication until their brainiacs had a chance to look at me. Brilliant plan. A friend in recovery used to say, if one person calls you a duck, you can ignore them. If 2 people call you a duck, you might want to consider it. But if 3 people call you a duck, you better start paddling. Quack. That's the word that went through my head when I finally got the notes from my visit to the world-famous medical clinic. At least it was unanimous. They all voted for functional neurologic disorder. As a bonus, one suggested adding la belle indifference to my list of issues. Okay, so you're probably wondering what the heck that is. It's a French phrase that translates to beautiful ignorance. Imagine a fancy Parisian woman lying on her chaise, puffing on a long-stemmed cigarette and laughing while the world around her burns to the ground. I imagine he'd gotten that impression because I'd been so happy when I got to the world-famous medical clinic for my examination. I was convinced I'd go home with a proper diagnosis and a plan for a world-class treatment, so much so that I'd relaxed and joked with my mother who accompanied me. The National Library of Science defines la belle indifference as a paradoxical absence of psychological distress despite a serious medical illness or symptoms of a health condition. This condition is most commonly associated with conversion disorder. Conversion disorder, aka hysteria. I'd been diagnosed with yet another form of hysteria. The kicker was that the physiotherapist based it on my lack of hysterics. I guess they'd expected me to behave more like a patient from one of those 1980s soap operas. The main thing I learned from that experience is not to self-medicate with laughter in the presence of physicians. They don't get it. Here's where we stand. 3 local neurologists, plus 1 from the clinic, plus 2 primary care physicians, plus a doctor of physiotherapy, plus a local rheumatologist, totaled up to what I call the crazy 8. All thought my symptoms were purely psychological. Dr. A, however, was the only one who dared believe there might be a physical issue. Feeling a little skeptical but not ready to throw in the towel, I started Dr. A's medication. Within 30 minutes, I experienced some gnarly gastric side effects, but on the bright side, I could dart from my office to the loo in record time. A silver lining, right? So, what exactly is myasthenia gravis? In my house, we just call it the gravis. Dr. Google will tell you it's an autoimmune neuromuscular disease that causes fatigable weakness. Yeah, you get tired from doing stuff. But that's true for everybody, isn't it? Well, not quite. So just kind of imagine it's like a bad cell phone connection between your nerves and your muscles, and the nerves are trying to tell the muscles what to do, but the muscles aren't quite getting the messages, so the nerves keep going, hello, 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 and the muscles are just not getting the message, or it's not coming through correctly. And it takes a lot of energy to keep repeating those messages over and over. You know how that is. So then, like, a motion that would take 1 unit of energy in a normal body can take anywhere from 10 to 100 units of energy in a body with myasthenia gravis. Yeah. Now, most people with the gravis start out with facial symptoms. Their eyes droop, or they might have some trouble swallowing or get tired chewing. For some, their chest muscles become so weak they suffocate. That's definitely a bad day. But I got pretty lucky. I skipped those issues and I went straight to the generalized form. It hit me below the neck. Not fun, but not deadly. Blood tests for myasthenia gravis check for specific antibodies, but mine came back negative. Dr. A, who I found out was a specialist in neuromuscular disorders, wasn't deterred. He believed I had the seronegative form of the gravis. Apparently, 2 out of 5 people at the time, they didn't have a test for the antibodies, and so they might have had the physical symptoms, but they couldn't prove it in the blood tests. So he disregarded the psychiatric diagnosis from the crazy 8, and he took me on as his patient. But then he dropped the bombshell. Here it came, finally, the radical treatment involving major surgery that could either kill or cure me. Not cure, it's an incurable disease, but think saws and everything like that. But why would I consider surgery when I had the crazy 8 in my head saying I was imagining it? I mean, I don't need to have my chest cut open for an imaginary illness, do I? But I would stick with the medication, but maybe it was a placebo effect, but I was feeling better and I was down with that. Months went by and I improved. I made so much progress I could ditch my cane and I started to feel a little hopeful. But then it started to turn. I started to need the cane, and then I needed the walker. And then one summer day in 2012, everything hit the fan. I woke up feeling tired. I worked from bed. And during a phone conference, went from leading the meeting to passing it off to a coworker because I couldn't make any sound. When my husband got home, I tried to explain what had happened, but all that came out was Porky Pig. Dr. A had me go back to the same hospital I'd been to when I first got sick. And I have to tell you that going to the hospital where your doctor's on staff versus where your doctor's not on staff is like the difference between flying first class and economy. One has you crammed into tiny seats with grumpy service, while the other has you lounging in comfort with snacks and service on demand. Trust me, first class is always better when you're having a bad health day. And myasthenia gravis is called a snowflake disease because every patient is different, and Dr. A had never had a patient with a stutter before. Now, if you have the gravis, there are a lot of medications that you can't take. This is anything from certain antibiotics to Botox, things you wouldn't even think of. And I was taking an antidepressant because I had these symptoms and the crazy 8 was in my head. So Dr. A, just to eliminate that as a potential cause for the stutter, had me stop taking it. Cold turkey. I don't know if you've ever experienced or watched somebody experience a cold turkey withdrawal from an antidepressant, but this is where you see hysteria. I was laughing, I was crying, I was irrational. The whole time I was just wild. And I'm relatively even-keeled. So this was a bit disturbing. And then the whole while, I'm stuttering like Porky Pig. Yeah. That was a weird day. I spent the rest of 2012 in bed. I had an in-home speech therapist who helped me learn that if I stayed perfectly still, I could speak without stuttering. I got a mobility scooter that was the equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, so if I needed to go somewhere, I could. But I stayed home and I worked and I finished my master's degree. Then, for my graduation, my husband and I went on a trip to Antarctica. Picture this. You're at the bottom of the world, surrounded by pristine waters, playful seals, majestic whales, and adorable penguins. The landscape? Serrated black mountaintops draped in pure white snow with ice blue mounds scattered around like giant macarons. Sounds like a dream, right? It should be. But for me, it was more of a nightmare wrapped in a snow globe. Why? Because while the world outside was breathtaking, inside I felt like a rotting corpse. Let's just say that getting to Antarctica wasn't the victory lap I'd envisioned. Instead of savoring every moment, I barely had the energy to drive my scooter around the ship's running track, snapping photos and making videos in hopes of remembering the experience when I was feeling less like, well, a decaying husk. My physical and mental health had taken a nosedive. In 3 short years, I'd lost a pregnancy and felt my body and mind crumble. The echoing doubts of the crazy 8 haunted me. Their dismissive opinions turned into hard rock power chords of self-doubt that played on repeat in my mind. In the vast emptiness of the Southern Ocean, my despair reached new heights. I found myself contemplating the unthinkable, jumping overboard. I imagined throwing myself off the balcony only to land on a lifeboat and traumatize everyone else on board. Frankly, I was too weak to even make it that far. So instead, I let the emotional dam burst. I sobbed, cried, and heaved until I passed out from sheer exhaustion. After that, something amazing happened. The next day, I woke up, wiped my face, and headed out to mingle with real live penguins. And you know what? Watching those little guys hang out on the beach with their babies, surfing those icy waves, made me realize that life, despite all its crap, still had its magical moments. So, even when the world felt like it was falling apart, those little penguins reminded me that there was still joy to be found. And if they could surf, surely there was hope for me. There's something about being home and back in the grind that kind of killed that hope. I remember being out with my girlfriends, and I heard myself whining about how there was nothing I could do to improve my situation. And as soon as the words left my lips, I knew I was wrong. I still had that radical option that Dr. A had told me about, the one where they would take saws and cut my chest open. That one. Yep. Now, it might seem strange to be talking about having my chest cut open to fix a problem with walking and weakness, but in patients that have myasthenia gravis, there often is a problem with the thymus. The thymus is a little organ that is actually most of your immune system before you're born, and as you grow up, it shrinks. And in normal adults, it's just tiny, tiny, tiny. But in some people with the gravis, it can go haywire. It can grow. It can give faulty instructions to your T cells and exacerbate your symptoms. Removing it sometimes could lead to remission or at least significant improvement in the symptoms. But what if I had the surgery and there was nothing wrong with my thymus? That would prove the crazy eight right? What if I had that surgery and it turned out I was mentally ill? After all the years I'd spent fighting to stay sober and to heal from all my past trauma, the idea I might find out I'm delusional about my physical suffering nearly broke my mind. But then again, some time off work didn't sound too bad. To say the surgery was a success would be an understatement and an overstatement. I went in worried I'd be exposed as a fraud and came out both vindicated by my giant diseased thymus and a hot mess because of surgical errors. Note, if you ever go in for major surgery, no matter how highly recommended they might be, just hit pause if your surgeon throws a tantrum in pre-op. Just saying. Complications aside, within days, I was speaking normally again, and walking unaided started to become a thing. Yes. Now, since then, there have been periods when the gravis retook partial control, but they were fairly short-lived and they never made me feel as ill. A few years later, I was diagnosed with a second autoimmune disease, sarcoidosis, but that time, a biopsy provided irrefutable evidence. Apparently, they travel in pairs. If you get one autoimmune disease, it's more likely you'll get a second. What's remained with me from my gravis experience, to a far greater extent than my incurable disease, is the way I'd been treated by the medical community. The crazy eight chose very quickly to blame my mind, making me doubt my diagnosis and delay surgery. Because I had nothing to prove them wrong, I reached a point of near suicide from despair I'd ever feel better. They ultimately put my life at risk because they chose to go with the easy answer rather than digging in and finding out what the actual cause was. I wrote letters to all the physicians who misdiagnosed me once I got better. I wanted to let them know about my thymic abnormality and point out what they'd missed and what they should have recognized as signs of my disease. None had taken a look at my thymus. None had conducted repetitive nerve stimulation tests. None had given me a trial on methadone. None ever responded. Only Dr. A had rejected outright the possibility of a psychiatric diagnosis, and perhaps because of this, only Dr. A applied the professional rigor necessary to identify what is a rare and largely misunderstood disease. It seems only Dr. A had the knowledge, humility, diligence, and concern required to give me my life back, and for that I am forever grateful. Occam's razor suggests that the simplest explanation is often the correct one. But what if the simple explanation is actually misleading, steeped in outdated, gender-biased myths, and ignorant of the rapid advancements in medical science and technology? Maybe it's time for a paradigm shift in diagnostic approach for cases where symptoms don't neatly align with known diseases. Instead of questioning a patient's mental health, essentially blaming them for having symptoms that don't fit neatly into a diagnostic box and adding to their distress, as in my case. Maybe physicians should acknowledge the reality. Medical knowledge is incomplete and imperfect. Any individual physician's knowledge is incomplete and imperfect. Diagnostic technology is incomplete and imperfect. Perhaps a diagnosis of medically unknown condition is needed in these cases to reflect the reality of medicine's limitations. Though not technically a diagnosis, it could at least spare patients the indignity of being misdiagnosed with yet another form of hysteria. It can also provide them with genuine hope. Take my experience with the Gravis. Initially, 2 out of 5 cases could not be diagnosed through blood antibody testing. Today, that number has dropped to less than 1 in 5. More patients are beginning effective treatments earlier in their disease course. I have to wonder what would have been different if my doctors hadn't dismissed my symptoms at the outset. At the very least, I could have been spared years of unnecessary disease progression, self-doubt, and loss of faith in the medical community. Despite overwhelming evidence, it seems the medical profession still doesn't trust their own ability to uncover new knowledge. Providing the option to apply a diagnosis of medically unexplained condition, if delivered with the proper care, could serve as a reminder to both patients and doctors that medical science continues to evolve and that hope is never lost. I would have appreciated that honesty and optimism. I hope that this was helpful to you, and that if you're going through a similar situation, or that you have gone through a similar situation, that you realize you're not alone. Sadly, this is not that uncommon a story. I've met so many people in waiting rooms at doctors' offices and clinics who told me the same thing happened to them. If you want to hear more details about my story, the book is available on Amazon in both Kindle and paperback format. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel. I'll be posting informative videos about the misapplication of these diagnoses in medicine and what we can do about it. If you have a similar story and you want to share it, put something in the comments or send me a direct message. I would love to hear it. Thank you so much for watching.